Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Session 3A, Community Engaged Research on Environmental Climate and Environmental and Energy Justice Issues. I'm Dr. Margot Brown, the Vice President of Environmental Justice and Equity at the Environmental Defense Fund. I am thrilled today because this is an amazing panel of researchers who've been really deeply entrenched in community engaged research to help understand the impact of environmental justice issues. And it's going to range from urban air pollution, water contamination, transportation inequity, energy justice, to climate related disparities around health quality, quality of life outcomes. So I really want to get started in the interest of time because we've got quite a few speakers. And I'm just going to list the five speakers in the order in which they're going to be presenting today. And I hope that we'll have enough time for them to get through their presentations and allow for a robust Q&A at the end. Our first speaker is Dr. Johnston. She is an associate professor in the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Southern California. Next up, we'll have Dr. Osborne, who is the co-founder of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance and is also a member of US EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She will be followed by Grace Lewis, who is an environmental epidemiologist at the Environmental Defense Fund. And then we have Jose Acosta Cordova, who is an environmental planning and research at the Little Village of Environmental Justice Organization, or LaVejo. And finally, we have Raj Pandya, the Vice President at the Thriving Earth Exchange. Please take it away, Jill.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, and it's really an honor to be here today with all the speakers, and I'm excited to be on this panel. There we go. So I'm going to talk and take everyone a little bit to Los Angeles, California, and talk about really what's been a collaboration between community organizing and research in order to address a lot of the disparities and health impacts that we face from current oil drilling operations. So next slide. So in Los Angeles, oil drilling actually launched over a century ago. And here we see historical pictures of the oil derricks that were set up all across the landscape in LA because the oil resource was really rich and close to the surface. The laws that governed ownership of both land and oil in this early 20th century California really encouraged rush, dense development. And by the mid-1920s, LA was the largest oil exporting region in the world. So we had thousands of oil derricks stretched across multiple oil fields that were really just intermingled with houses and businesses. And this kind of launched this pattern of development in which these industrial operations were occurring alongside where people lived. Next slide. So in the last 2 decades, what we've really seen is the advance of technologies and this resurgence of this drive for oil extraction and energy independence, that we saw a lot more oil extraction in neighborhoods. So here, particularly in the neighborhood of South LA, which is historically marginalized and racialized communities, it was really the community residents that sat on the other side of the fence of this oil drilling operation that started to experience odors, nosebleeds, headaches, and realized that what was happening behind the wall was 23 oil extraction wells. And so these operations had really gone unnoticed and unregulated for decades. Next slide. So it was through the organizing and capacity building really in the community that started to document the health impacts people were facing and bring attention to this industry that had largely been ignored by both public health officials, by air quality regulators, and other politicians in California. Next slide. And what we had really realized is that in Los Angeles, we had unmatched sort of density of oil extraction and proximity. So there were homes and schools that were less than 50 feet from where oil was actively being extracted from lands. And there was no sort of regulation that influenced the siting of where these operations could be occurring. Next slide. And then through mapping tools, there's continues to be about 5,000 active and idle wells here in Los Angeles County. They're really concentrated in communities of color, especially in the urban, central, and southern part of the region. And that the vast majority of these wells are operating less than 500 meters from where people are living. So next slide. And really to understand what's happening sort of behind these fences and underneath the concrete of many of these wells, is that there's sort of a derrick or pump jack that extracts the oil out of the ground, along with an extensive network of pipelines and storage tanks that can often leak and occasionally explode. The equipment that operates these wells and brings things on and off site are diesel powered. And frequently these well pads are about the size of 2 to 4 city lots, have dozens of wells, and have massive infrastructure that spiders underground. So in LA, we do not typically see what's known as like hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which involves the injection of high volumes of water, but often there is a lot of injection of sort of concentration of chemicals into these wells. Next slide. And sort of both because of the response of regulators that really put the onus on the community to prove that these wells were causing health impacts or harm to them, we sort of launched a conversation or collaboration with various community organizations to address a lot of their identified concerns. So ultimately, they wanted to understand how we could better regulate and protect public health in LA. And really looked at air pollution as the key route of exposure here in these urban communities. They also noted a lot of enforcement disparities between wells that were operating in South and South Central LA compared to those in the wealthier and wider communities. Next slide. So we specifically worked in 2 neighborhoods here in the Las Ciénegas oil field, which is located in South LA, which is predominantly Black and brown in many immigrant communities. And wanted to understand both what the impacts on health was of the community as well as on air quality. And as you see in these areas, they're densely populated communities with many homes shown in the red. And these are also among the most environmentally burdened communities in the state of California. So next slide. And with this gives you an idea of the 2 wells. When we were working, one was active, so the Jefferson Park site. So there's 28 oil and gas wells that were extracting during the time that we were conducting the health study. And the other site we were using because of community organizing, this site has actually gone idle, so it wasn't actively producing oil and gas wells. Next slide. So in the research collaboration, we worked with local community-based organizations. After a lot of conversations, decided to focus on respiratory health. Sort of look across the lifespan, meaning that we were going to enroll and look at families, so from youth to elderly and vulnerable populations in the community. And also try to make this accessible as possible. So we conducted the survey in English, Spanish, and Korean so people could participate in the language they felt most comfortable in. Next slide. Sort of through collaborations with the community group Esperanza Community Housing, we were able to leverage their promotora or community health worker model and train these sort of community experts in human subjects research, in administering surveys, and collecting measurements. And so they were able to really lead and engage through collaborations with elementary school, churches, door-to-door, and neighborhood meetups to get people involved in this health study. Next slide. So ultimately, we recruited about 960 participants from nearly 500 households in these 2 neighborhoods. About a third of the participants were children, and also about 25% were over 60. It was a more female cohort, and we had participants that identified as Latino or Latinx, Black, and Asian. About 15% were asthmatic, so this captures some of these health burdens and disparities that the community already faced, and had lived in the neighborhood for a long period of time. We focused on residents that were less than 1,000 meters, which is around 3,000 feet from the site, and most people lived about 250 meters away. So next slide. So through all this, kind of our key findings from this was we saw an increased reporting of acute symptoms, especially respiratory symptoms, among people that were living near the active drill site. And this included wheezing, sore throat, chest tightness, dizziness, and eye and nose irritation. And these findings were consistent after we adjusted for a variety of demographic and other variables. We also found, as we measured people's lung function, so that tells you more about the size and the strength of their lungs, that the closer someone lived to an oil and gas operation, the lower their lung function. And that these effects were more pronounced at the active site, but we found it at both sites, which suggests really some long-term harm from the activities that could happen to the residents of the community. And finally, we were able to sort of document and add to the lived experience of the residents to really demonstrate that these neighborhoods near urban oil drilling sites were facing respiratory health impacts, and these could be driving some of the environmental health disparities we observe in these neighborhoods. Also, we try to make sure all these results were presented back to the community. So this is a little bit small, but shows our infographics that we presented to really share back these tools and these findings to all the participants. And then next slide. And then finally, with these community collaborations, we are also able to set up our own community air monitoring network to look at methane, which is an indicator of natural gas, as well as some other volatile toxins that can come from these sites. And we're also able to identify sort of higher levels of these emissions near the site compared to farther away. And we even saw methane and some other toxins related to the idle site, suggesting that even though they weren't producing oil, they were still contributing to potential air quality issues in the area. And then next slide. Finally, really excited with this collaboration and community academic partnership to really leverage not only the community organizing, but the scientific research to really inform an ordinance in the city of LA, as well as in the county of LA, around phasing out of both any new oil wells, as well as the existing oil wells. So this passed within the last year. And so now we're working together to think about not only how to implement this phase out, how to implement a just transition, but also how to make sure that these sites are like cleaned up and become a usable asset for the community. At the statewide level, there's a proposal for a 3,200 foot or 1 kilometer setback for any new wells, and there's discussion around an increase the buffer around the existing wells. And so sort of this contributing data to this conversation really helped move some of the public health and the policy agenda, because the lack of data was the most frequently cited reasons for regulators not to take any action. And so finally, in the last slide, I just want to acknowledge all the collaborators and all the community organizers that helped and facilitate this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. Greatly appreciate your presentation. Dr. Osborne, you are up next. So we're going to go to Dr. Osborne.
Thank you so much. I think Courtney has the slides, so we'll just see if those get up. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my work in that's focused in Atlanta, Georgia. So I've titled my presentation, Taking Science to the Streets, Participatory Research Approaches to Improve Environment, Health, and Quality of Life in Urban Areas. And I'm really talking from my vantage point as I like to think of myself as a scholar activist. I have an academic role, but I'm deeply rooted in the community. In fact, I got to academia sort of through the work that I was already doing in the community as the co-founder of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. You can go to the next slide, please. And so just to tell a little bit about, my background as well, you can actually go on to the next slide. I got interested in this work because of the time that I spent as an adolescent growing up in Louisiana's Cancer Alley corridor. I'm originally from Mississippi, but that time in Louisiana just had a very it was very impactful. After living in this area and living in close proximity to a polluting facility, even within a middle class neighborhood. Um, my mother's diagnosis with breast cancer really gave me this impetus to want to get involved. Not that we could make connections between what we may have been exposed to and her diagnosis, but really just the fact that the possibility existed, gave me sort of that push. I definitely remember the air pollution index always being high, the water smelling and tasting bad. Even physiologically for myself, I experienced light colored splotches all over my skin that I didn't have before I moved to Louisiana, and they went away after I moved away. And doctors could never figure out what was happening after a battery of allergy tests, and trying to figure out if it was a product that I was using or something that I was eating. They came up with nothing. So those were the things that helped me to understand that there was something about my environment that was impacting my health in particular. Next slide. And so this is actually one of those facilities that was in less than a mile away from my family home in Louisiana, and where I still have family living today. Next slide. So I know, because we're as a part of this conference, that we all have a firm grasp on the fact that that place matters, and so I'll talk a little bit about some of my experiences, in my community and doing research in my community in Atlanta, as we think about this idea of communities of opportunity versus communities that are low income and/or communities of color that oftentimes don't have the same amenities and don't have the same opportunities that other communities have. Next slide. So much of my work takes place in the South and Southeast, what I dub the Dirty South. We're the Black Belt, the Bible Belt, but we also are a place where there is disproportionate exposure to environmental toxicants and hazards for a number of communities. And I know that these issues are not limited to the South, but I want to talk about them in particular in the South today. Next slide. And so as we think about, the South and everything that we can conjure up about the South, from, Jim Crow laws to segregation to other things, Dr. Robert Bullard, who many people call the father of environmental justice, says that the South has a legacy of unequal protection. Why would the environment be any different? Next slide. And so if we think about Atlanta, just to kind of narrow things down really quickly, this is in 2009, so many years ago now. America's most toxic city was Atlanta, per a feature that shows up in Forbes magazine on an annual basis. And so that particular year, they were looking at the number of EPA responses in the principal city, the facilities releasing toxic chemicals, pounds of toxic chemicals released, as well as the air quality ranking. Next slide. Also, beyond that, study that Forbes did, or that feature that they ran in 2009, 3 years later in 2012, there was a study called The Patterns of Pollution that looked at demographics and environmental hazards in a 14-county metropolitan Atlanta area. And in this study, there were 52 environmental justice hotspots identified, so places where you have multiple pollution sources overlapping with some level of intense social vulnerability. And then you had 14 environmental justice cold spots. So the hot spots are in red, the cold spots are in blue. The cold spots also had multiple environmental exposures or hazards, in some of those locations, but didn't have the same level of social vulnerability. And so the community that is closest, or where I live, is closest to this, and it's really small, so you can't see it well. This number 4 hotspot, which is in on the west side of the city of Atlanta. And so Fulton County is the most populous county in Georgia. You've got the northern part of Fulton County here, and the city is kind of mostly located right here. And then South Fulton has some impacts as well. Next slide, please. So this is a map just of Fulton County in particular. And here you're able to really see that, there are some environmental stressors or hazards in the northern part of the county, which is more affluent and more white. But things are most heavily concentrated in the city of Atlanta and in parts of South Fulton County, where your population is primarily Black. We definitely have, diverse, diverse income strata within Atlanta, but Atlanta also is the poster child for income inequality. Next slide, please. And just as in other cities, life expectancy in Atlanta differs based on where you live. And so if you can think about that little circle that I showed you where that number 4 environmental justice hotspot was a couple of maps ago, that is the community that I'm talking about here, or one of the communities, the Bankhead neighborhood, which people die on average at the age of 63.6. And that has a 24-year difference in life expectancy from folks who live in the Vinings area, which is not in the city of Atlanta proper, but it's in a very close suburb. And in fact, these neighborhoods are less than 10 miles apart from each other, but a 24-year difference in life expectancy. Next slide. And so as I have engaged in work with communities in Atlanta, part of it has been around trying to uncover, what is driving this difference in life expectancy? What are the environmental hazards that exist, in certain communities, and in particular communities on the West Side? How can we be aware of what they are, understand the data, and then press for actionable change? And so in terms of this community engaged research, I just wanted to reference the fact that there's a big difference between doing research that's performed on a population or community, in that community or population, or with the folks who are in that community or population. And please forgive the errors in how things are translated here on the slide. Next slide, please. This is just a quick comparison of, traditional academic research versus community research. Don't really have time to go into it, but what I want to really pull out is that when we're talking about this community engaged research, it's really the positionality of the researcher is one of a collaborator, a learner, collaborating with community members and community residents and leaders who are helping to design and develop those research questions, who are engaged in the research, in the data collection, and who are also engaged in the data analysis, interpretation, and how we translate that data into action to better the community. And in fact, that is the goal. We're trying to not just advance generalizable knowledge, but to make some positive change happen in the community. Next slide. And so I want to talk, we can skip this one, just in terms of CBPR, community science. I'll just kind of mention is, one of the approaches that I engage a lot in my research, working with community members, having them involved in every piece of the scientific process, from developing those questions, to, how we again translate the data into action for change. Next slide. And then I just wanted to mention sort of the street science framework that joins together these local insights with professional scientific techniques, with these concurrent goals of improving scientific inquiry and advancing environmental health policy and decision making. And so, next slide, in the context of the work that I've been doing in Atlanta, there are a few examples that I want to share. One comes from the Proctor Creek watershed on the west side of Atlanta. Next slide. Proctor Creek is the creek itself is, used to be a source of pride for West Atlanta communities. And really, it still is. But it's been a place where children have played, people have, fished and swam, and where people were baptized. The creek is now one of the most environmentally impaired creeks in metropolitan Atlanta. Atlanta, but it's changing because of the action that community members are taking. Next slide. And some of the work that we've been engaged in has been through things like water quality monitoring, working with community residents to collect water quality samples. Next slide. And not only, adult community members, but youth and young adults, really getting them engaged in the work as well. Next slide. And here you just, see some of the equipment that, folks are learning to use as they're taking their samples. We also engage them in trying to understand and interpret the data that we find after we look at levels of things like E. coli. We look at, E. coli bacteria as one of the parameters that we're concerned about because of the fact that we have aging and really old infrastructure in parts of our community, especially on the west side. We have raw, untreated sewage that flows into our creeks and streams when there are heavy rain events because of the combined sewer overflow system that we have. And these creeks and streams flow through people's front yards, backyards, public parks, and school grounds. Next slide. And so residents have not only been engaged in the water quality monitoring, but also trying to, develop kind of a set of meaningful street level environmental health indicators. When people talk about, the challenges, within the community, you might think about the water quality, but people, our agencies, public health agencies, as well as, folks like agencies like EPA who were engaged in the watershed weren't thinking about things like illegal dumping, about, the things that are triggering flooding, in the community. And so through a community engaged process, community members developed a set of indicators. We worked with students at a local institution to develop an app, and community members have begun to map these environmental hazards in the community. Next slide. One last project that I'll mention, and I'll just say with both the water quality monitoring and the mapping of environmental hazards, these projects are works in progress, but we've been able to get greater attention from, city and municipal entities. We've been able to get some dump sites addressed. We've been able to help spur on some fixes in our sewer system, all because this community data revealed that there was much more pollution. In some cases, there was, massive, pollution of our local waterways. And the city was not aware, of this until this community collected and generated data was presented to them. So we're seeing some gains in that work in terms of getting policy and practice changed as a result of communities being engaged in this work. And the last thing I'll just mention is that I have a new project that is about a little over a year old called Urban Heat ATL, in which students and community members are mapping urban heat islands in Atlanta. So we're trying to understand what neighborhoods are suffering the most from exposure to extreme heat. And we see this definitely as a reflection of the compound impacts of historic racism, including redlining, in terms of the communities that are most impacted. Next slide. And so through this process, we are equipping community members as well as students from Spelman College and Georgia Tech with handheld, low-cost sensors. They're called Pocket Lab sensors. And we are, collecting data at the street level as people are walking and or biking, if that applies, through their neighborhoods. And we're getting a chance to observe some of these variations, in temperature as we're crossing community boundaries, as we're moving from places that have a lot of trees and vegetation, parks and green space to those that don't, et cetera. And we're working to impact, policy change, as well as kind of adaptation measures that can be taken right now, to do things like make sure that we have cooling centers in the right places, during some of these extreme weather or extreme temperature surges that we're experiencing, this summer, and that we expect to experience in time to come. Next slide. I think I should be just about ready there. So I think this is my last slide, just to show that we have collected over 1 million data points since 2020, since last year, and we'll continue to do that work moving forward. And I think that actually was my last slide.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne. Jose, I'm going to hand it over to you in the interest of time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this incredible panel with some people who are doing amazing work. So my name is Jose Acosta. I currently work at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization based in Chicago, Illinois. I'm actually the Senior Transportation Policy Analyst, and I lead most of our transportation policy work at the state level and at the local level as well. I'm also a third-year PhD student in Geography and GIS at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I'll be talking a little bit about the organization that I work for and some of the work that we're doing. I think for me, as somebody who's already has the years of experience working in the EJ movement, but also pursuing a PhD. I think that it's the conversation that was just had about how do you do engaged research and real community-based research. I think is really important, right? When you have people that come from the communities that we come from, and then are investing back into our communities either through research or in different ways. I think it's really important. So a little bit about myself before I go to my slides. I was actually raised in the EJ movement. Both of my parents were activists involved. I was born in Chicago, but raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So both of my parents were involved with the Southwest Organizing Project, SWAP, and then also the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, SNEEJ, who are some of the organizations that put together or that brought people together for the first People of Color Summit, and also for the in Jemez Pueblo in '96 when they did the principles for democratic organizing. And I was actually a little kid. I was 8 years old at the time, running around that gathering. So for me not to be continuing this work as an adult is really special to me. And also both of my grandparents. My grandparents were a combination of coal miners, factory workers, as well as bracero, farm workers in California. So the EJ issues run deep in my blood. Next slide, please. So Little Village is they're in yellow. It's located kind of between the west side and the southwest side of the city. People consider it the southwest side for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about in the further slide, but just to give you a sense of where Little Village is located in Chicago. Next slide, please. And it's a neighborhood that is predominantly Latino, Latinx. It's about 85%. And it's a neighborhood that is actually the largest concentration of Mexicans in the Midwest. And it's also known as Mexico of the Midwest. So for those of you who aren't familiar or who haven't been to the neighborhood, highly recommend taking a drive down 26th Street or walking down 26th Street, getting some of the best tacos that you'll have. And it's a community that was built around industry. Latinos in particular started coming into the neighborhood in the 60s and 70s as a result of a number of different external factors like displacement in other neighborhoods, as well as white flight, and then of course a mass influx of Mexican immigrants in the 60s and 70s as well into the city. So Little Village became one of the ports of entry for Mexicans and other Latino immigrants during that time period, and has actually grown for a number of years. Had grown into the largest Latino neighborhood in the city, but with massive population loss in the last 20 years, it has been since been surpassed. It's like I said, neighborhood that grew around industry. You can see there on the bottom portion of the boundaries, there's a body of water that goes through. That's the sanitary and ship canal, which I'll talk more about in a second. But you see all the area located directly north and south is all industrial land, actually about 54% of the total area in Little Village is dedicated to industry, which has contributed to Little Village having the second worst air quality in the state of Illinois as a community. We have a number of different facilities oil and gas facilities, asphalt plants, construction, waste management, and of course, transportation, distribution, logistics, which we have some of the highest concentration in the region as well. So next slide, please. So this is the sanitary and ship canal, and it's actually the most significant reason why Chicago is the large city that it is. This investment actually initially happened in 1848 with the construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and then was replaced in 1900 by the sanitary and ship canal. And when they replaced it, they did two things that were really significant. They widened it to be able to allow for larger ships to pass through. And then they also reversed the flow of the water away from Lake Michigan, which was the city's source of drinking water, and towards the Illinois River, which ultimately feeds into the Mississippi River. And the reason why this canal was so significant was because it connected Lake Michigan with the Mississippi River, and thus made it possible to take a boat between either the St. Lawrence River or the Erie Canal in New York, and get through the Great Lakes, and then you end up here at the Port of Chicago, and then take this canal to the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, and of course the Mississippi River connects to many other large rivers and the Gulf of Mexico as well, and this made it possible to actually settle the inner, and actually colonize the inner part of the continent. So that's part of the reason why Chicago grew the way that it did, and yeah, I'll stop there because there's definitely a lot more I can go into on that, but I'll stop there. And you can see again the industry that's all located along the canal. Next slide, please. So who we are as an organization, we are established in 1994, and again are part of countless communities that are fighting the same fight, not only here in the U.S. but across the planet. Next slide, please. And we have 4 major campaigns that we're working on. The Just Transition, which also includes the transportation work that I'm doing. We have a food justice campaign, water justice campaign, and open space and park justice campaign. And within all those campaigns, we have a significant amount of youth engagement component to all the work that we do. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with Chicago, but you may have heard just how segregated the city is, and these maps show what that looks like. The one on the left is from 2000, and then the other one is 2010, and it shows just how significant those racial and ethnic boundaries are in the city. But I want you to focus more on the south side and the west side, where African American and Latino populations live, which are the blue and kind of yellowish gold color. Next slide, please. So then think about those racial boundaries, and then look at some of these maps I'm about to show you. This map shows where heavy industry is located, or where it's zoned for. These are our 26 official industrial corridors in the city, the largest of which are located in Black and brown communities. And you see the purple is manufacturing, and the green is manufacturing and moving, storing goods. So this is again where all the heavy pollution is concentrated in the city. Next slide, please. And then think about those maps in relation to these maps, right? The one on the left was made with NRDC, a collaborative effort between the Chicago EJ network and then NRDC, and it looked at the cumulative burden of all this industry combined with different socioeconomic factors. It came up with the cumulative impacts map, and yeah, so it shows where heavy industry is located and how it relates to pollution and cumulative burden. And then this map was made in 2018, and then in 2020, CDPH, the Chicago Department of Public Health, made a similar map and added in a few different factors, but again showing that pollution is concentrated in the south and west sides of the city. Next slide, please. So a little bit about some of the EJ victories that we've had in the last decade. The main one that we're the most proud of was the closure of a coal plant, actually 2 coal plants, one in Little Village and one in a neighboring community of Pilsen. It was a 12-year fight, and actually we collaborated with some researchers from Harvard, and they found that there was 550 ER visits, 1,800 severe asthma attacks, and 42 premature deaths attributed to the coal plant every year. And even with that study actually came out in 2003, and it still took us 9 years to close this plant down. So it was something that the city was very much in support of in terms of keeping the coal plant operating. But finally, after 12-year fight, we were able to shut it down, and then now it's been remediated, and it's been demolished, remediated, and now being replaced by a 1.3 million square foot warehouse. So we traded in one source of pollution for another, and we also during that time period after it closed, we were part of a task force to reuse the space. Unfortunately, our former mayor, Rahm Emanuel, went behind the community's back and sold it to a company who was replacing it now. So next slide, please. And then the other one was the construction of this park, La Vita Park, which is one of two parks in the community. It was formerly a Superfund site. It was a asphalt plant called Celotex. So this was a 14-year fight that we, to remediate this site, and then replace it with the park. What's it called? It actually sits on top of a 10-foot cap because the community came together and decided that we didn't want to send the pollution to another community somewhere else. So we capped it, and now it's a beautiful park. I recommend if anybody goes to Chicago to check it out. And then next slide, please. And then just really quick to go over some of the current work that I'm doing. So I mentioned right that I do transportation policy. So most of my work is focused on freight and warehousing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Chicago infrastructure, we actually are the part of the continent with the most rail infrastructure. This is the only place in the continent where 6 out of 7 Class 1 railroads converge. And so because of that, we have 19 intermodal rail yards, which is by far the most of any place in the country. So these intermodal rail yards attract tens of thousands of trucks every day. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go ahead and just keep going on to the next slides. And if there's questions, we can talk more about it. And this is what Little Village looks like in terms of the concentration of the TDL facilities. So we're currently working on, we actually put together a heavy duty trucking coalition. And we are in the process of advocating for the governor to adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the NOx Omnibus Rule. And shout out to the folks in California who've led that fight. And yeah, so that's where we're at right now. Last slide just shows our contact information. If you just want to follow us on social media. And yeah, hopefully we can talk some more about this at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Grace, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And thank you for having me on the panel today. I'm going to be talking about the work that we are engaged in Houston with our data to action communities, and really try to uplift the work that they do and that we have been doing together. Next slide, please. So I'll just briefly show our EJ vision and equity statement at the Environmental Defense Fund, where we believe clean air, water, and sustainable food is a human right and strive to eliminate the root causes of injustice. Next slide, please. So I really will just wanted to say that our Houston Data to Action work was first initiated as a result of Hurricane Harvey, which was nearly 5 years ago this month. And we saw as a result of Harvey that the communities in East Houston, already overburdened by environmental justice issues, were the same ones first and worst impacted by this climate catastrophe. And you can see that, in the aftermath of that, years later, we're still being plagued by Winter Storm Uri and chemical tank fires that have continued to impact these communities, environmental justice communities on the east side of Houston. Next slide, please. Historical policies like redlining and the purposeful placement of industrial facilities concentrated these facilities, releasing toxic chemicals in Black and Brown, lower wealth communities in Harris County, which is the third most populous county in the United States. So, as several of our speakers previously on this panel have shown, it's the same issue of having these former policies which have resulted in the concentration of industrial facilities in and around these environmental justice neighborhoods. In fact, in 2020, more than 9.6 million pounds of toxic chemicals were released into the air. And many of these are clustered, as you can see, on the east side near the Houston Ship Channel. Next slide, please. And if we look at the EPA's risk screening environmental indicators, or RISI, we can see that the air releases pose the greatest threat to Houston residents, particularly those living over the fence line or adjacent to these industrial facilities, as our city, Houston, lacks zoning. So you could have facilities clustered next to schools or churches or parks, or just over the fence line from where somebody is living. And the chemical and petroleum industries account for 67.3% of Harris County's RISI score. And urban air toxics like ethylene oxide, benzene, butadiene, and formaldehyde are of particular concern to environmental justice communities. And a lot of times there's insufficient amount of air monitors that really help us understand the true magnitude of the everyday exposures that people who live next to facilities that release these chemicals are experiencing. Next slide, please. Now, there are a lot of maps here, and I'm not going to go into a detailed description, but I just wanted to show these maps because they're reflecting the chronic diseases, the prevalence of chronic diseases that have been associated with air pollution in Harris County using the 2021 CDC Places data. Now, the darkest blue represents the highest prevalence of disease, and they're typically, as you can see from these maps, clustered in environmental justice neighborhoods, mostly on the east side of Houston, but also in the south part of Houston, such as in the neighborhood of Sunnyside. Now, you might or might not be able to see, because it's pretty lot of data here on these maps, that there are 4 neighborhoods that are highlighted in yellow, which we're going to discuss later in our presentation. But these are our 4 partner communities that are part of Data to Action. Next slide, please. And this is going to be one of the last sets of maps that I'm going to show, and for your reference, that is. And here on the left-hand side, I've overlaid the 2020 toxic release inventory facilities, those orange dots, on top of a map showing the percentage of people without health insurance. And you can see that it's a pretty startling picture, and that Houston itself has got over 40% uninsured in our city. And on the right-hand side, we see life expectancy, with the lowest quintile of life expectancy in dark blue, meaning the ones with the shortest life expectancy in the darkest colors. And in some EJ neighborhoods, just like one of our previous presenters talking about Cancer Alley, in neighborhoods like Pleasantville and in Fifth Ward, life expectancy can be as much as 20 years lower than the more affluent parts of the city. Next slide, please. So we selected, partnered with 4 community-based organizations serving neighborhoods with the greatest cumulative vulnerability based on the Houston, Galveston, Brazoria, and Virus Screen, a tool we created to look at the cumulative vulnerability from a number of different factors, such as flooding, social and economic indicators, health, environment, and exposures and risk. And so we ranked all of these communities, and among the top highest ranking communities, we invited and we selected 4 communities to be a part of our Data to Action project. They are Achieving Community Tasks Successfully, or ACTS, from Pleasantville, the Coalition of Community Organizations, or COCO, from Fifth Ward, The Environmental Community Advocates of Galena Park, ECAP, from Galena Park, and the Sunnyside Community Redevelopment Organization, SCRO, from Sunnyside. The first three of these communities are also port communities, which means that they're less than 5 miles from the Houston Ship Channel and the Port of Houston. And our fourth community, shown on the bottom or to the south, is Sunnyside. And while it's not directly adjacent to the Ship Channel, they're home to landfills and heavily burdened with industrial activity and several Superfund sites that are nearby. Next slide, please. And this is a recent photo that we took of some of our leaders from our community organizations, Data Action Community Leaders, that is, celebrating the joint submission of the Houston Data Action group, that is, for an EPA air monitoring grant to define the baseline levels of air toxics in Harris County, focusing on residential areas and those super emitting facilities that are adjacent to a lot of their neighborhoods. We provide funding, data, technical support, and guidance to help Data to Action community organizations develop their EJ action plans for their communities. The communities define their priorities and their desired solutions. And over the past several years, we've supported them to implement their action plans and other advocacy efforts. We assist them in grant writing, GIS mapping, citizen science work, and capacity building in collaboration with Texas Southern University. And they work together and support each other's work. So nearly all of the work that they undertake is participatory based. So they take input from their residents, from planning all the way through implementation. And it's been an incredible journey to see the development and growth of them in their communities and all of the incredible things that they've been able to do. Next slide, please. So the next few pages, I'm going to just illustrate each community's action plan priorities. So on the left of each of these next few slides, you'll see actually from their action plans what they have defined as their community priorities. But I will just highlight for you some of the accomplishments that they have been able to do. And ACTS in particular, they just this last year completed a Casper-based community health survey to understand what are the chronic health conditions related to the environment among their residents. But they also use this as a way to gather disaster preparedness information and disaster planning. They also were the first to launch their own community-owned and operated air monitoring network. It has been incredibly successful and has been a case study for the EPA on air monitoring. And recently, their advocacy work, a successful advocacy campaign, has resulted in the state, the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, approving a regulatory monitor be placed in their community. And they took direct input from the community, from ACTS in particular, on where they would like to see that monitor placed in their community. They've done other incredible work, such as oral history work, and have continued to have a tireless fight against municipal setting designations and demanding the cleanup of historical contamination in and around their community. Next slide, please. And so now I'll move on to Coco's Fifth Ward community, which has successfully launched a block captain program to educate the community about environmental hazards, identifying and referring homes to the city of Houston, which has a HUD abatement program to address lead in older homes in the community because of the high levels of blood lead levels of in children. And the block captains have also done something incredibly amazing and historic, which is that they have collected soil and water samples to measure levels of heavy metals and chemicals that may be related to the historical creosote contamination in their community. In the past years, there have been 2 cancer clusters identified in this community. And so the work that they're doing has been really impactful in being able to gather these samples and analyze them to just show as citizen scientists so that they can talk to regulators about the contamination in their community. And like Pleasantville, their advocacy work has resulted in a state regulatory air monitor that will be placed in their community later this fall, in which they had a hand in saying where the air monitor should go. They continue to work on brownfields and other work in their community, and have successfully fought the expansion of concrete facilities, which then subsequently had their permit withdrawn. Next slide, please. Our third community-based organization, ECAP, in Galena Park Galena Park itself was on the air pollution watch list for the state of Texas for about 17 years. And as a result of this history of air pollution and air releases in their community, their leaders of their community organization have been very forward in deploying air sensors to measure air toxics in their community. Their advocacy work has also resulted in alerts being communicated to their residents in Spanish. This was not being done prior to their advocacy work, and is important because the majority of the residents in their community are Spanish speaking. They're also addressing the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables and food deserts in their community by hosting a quarterly farmers market. Next slide, please.
Unfortunately, Grace, we are really running out of time right now in order to get time in for Raj to speak. So if we could have you just draw your presentation to conclusion. Thank you.
Absolutely. This is my last slide, actually. And it's just to talk about Sunnyside. And they have, in the last year, deployed their own sensors, community air monitoring network in churches across the community. And with some of the worst asthma rates in the region, they're now active participants in the Asthma Coalition and the Greater Houston Local Emergency Planning Committee. And they have been tirelessly working to make vaccines and testing sites available, as well as addressing food insecurity by food distributions in their community. So really want to uplift the hard work and important accomplishments that these communities have done, and making the data that actionable for their advocacy work. So thank you.
Thank you. Raj, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for just this amazing panel and for all of the incredible work that everyone is doing. My name is Raj Pandya. I'm speaking to you from, my pronouns are he and him. I'm speaking to you from Boulder, Colorado, which is land that was taken from the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people. And Colorado is home to 48 contemporary tribes. I'm offering that acknowledgement as a way to remind myself, and sort of in my profession and in my personal life, to think about justice and repairing past harms, and how science can be, and the work I do, can be an ally for justice. For folks who might have trouble seeing, a little visual orientation, I'm wearing a black t-shirt. I've got tortoiseshell glasses on, and I have grayish, more gray than black actually, hair, and I'm in a blue room. So next slide, please. I want to start with this picture. This is a picture that was taken about a mile from my grandfather's house in Bombay. And there's a couple of things that really strike me about this picture. It's taken in Darby, which is one of the largest impermanent settlements in the world. And what you're seeing are two things. You're seeing a stream, a natural stream that has been so environmentally degraded that it's no longer a source of nourishment or health to anyone in the neighborhood. And you're also seeing a pipe that's carrying municipal water, clean drinking water, through this neighborhood to one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Mumbai, one of the richest neighborhoods in Mumbai. And there's something incredibly striking about the juxtaposition of environmental degradation and a scientific and technological solution, and the ways in which inequity and environmental degradation seem to complement or reinforce one another. There's a history of exploitation of nature and exploitation of people going hand in hand. And there's a complicity of science and technology in that history. And that invites me to think about a new approach to science. And if we go to the next slide, you've already heard about this new approach to science. All of my colleagues on this panel have talked about it. It has so many names. I usually use the term community science, but all of these things have at their roots this idea of equitable collaboration between scientists and community leaders to walk through every step of the scientific or a scientific process together, to even question what counts as a scientific process, to push against the boundaries of what we think about as science, and all in the context of getting something meaningful done to build a better, more sustainable, more just world for all people and all creatures. That's what I think we mean by community science, and it has so many names and so many flavors. And I want to acknowledge particularly that it has roots well outside academic communities, that environmental justice communities are at the forefront of thinking about how we reinvent science. And we have a lot to learn from the collaboration with those communities. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about some of what I think are the fundamental principles of community science. And there, again, I feel like I'm repeating stuff you've heard already from the panel, but for me, one of the most foundational principles is community science always begins with community priorities. It's never about scientists coming in and telling communities what they should do or even what they could do. It's about asking communities about their priorities, their aspirations, their vision for the future, and finding ways that science can be an ally in those priorities. And that word priorities is like super important to me. One of the first projects I got involved with was with Mayor Washington in Midway, Georgia. And she said something that stuck with me forever. She said, "I am tired of rich cities having priorities and poor cities having needs." This is an example of a project we did in the Pamir Mountains. And what I love about this project is it was using climate science to support traditional ecologic calendars, a knowledge system and a way of working that was thousands of years old. And there was something beautiful about the humility of not trying to offer science instead of a traditional way of knowing, but offering science as a complement to and at the invitation of a traditional way of knowing. That idea of beginning with community priorities has in it a kind of humility about the role of science and the contribution science can make. The second principle, if we go to the next slide, is end with community impact. Sometimes I work in a program called Thriving Earth Exchange, and one of our informal catchphrases is, "A paper is not an impact." Even if you put community leader names on the paper, even if you write the paper with community leaders, that is still not an impact. An impact is using science along with all kinds of other ways of knowing and other kinds of community knowledges to get something meaningful done, to make a difference in the community, to point a way for other communities to get something done. This is a project in Louisiana. This is the underside of the I-10 freeway. It was built through the Claiborne neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood, thriving middle-class neighborhood that was decimated by this freeway. There were also thousands of trees and hundreds of homes that were removed for this freeway. Ever since, residents have been trying to get the freeway gone. They've been trying to get rid of it. We worked with Amy Stelly, who was leading a neighborhood campaign to try to build awareness about the damage the freeway had done. We helped her design protocols that could collect air, water, and noise pollution data. She took that data all the way to the US Congress. And as a result of her actions and that small contribution of the data collection that our scientists helped with, money to remove freeways in her neighborhood and other neighborhoods like hers was included in the infrastructure bill. That's what it means to end with a community impact. And the important lesson for me is that science is never enough. It can contribute, it can be a partner, but it's never enough to achieve that community impact. Third principle, science is a human right. Every community deserves the right to ask and answer their scientific questions. Every community deserves the opportunity to investigate what's going on in their neighborhood. Too many communities don't have access to the scientific tools to answer their questions. And we saw it again and again in all of the previous conversations. Communities knew what was going on. They understood what was happening. They didn't have access to the scientific tools or the scientific techniques that could give them validity. And I want to leave aside the question of why it takes that outside validity. I'm not sure that's exactly right. But the reality is often science can be an ally in providing that validity for something people know and experience and live every day. This is a project in Northeast Houston again. It's a neighborhood that was experiencing constant flooding. And residents were convinced that that flooding wasn't because of hydrological differences. It wasn't because of changes in precipitation patterns in that one neighborhood. It was because of infrastructure. Working with hydrologists, accessing available information, not easy to find information, but available data, collecting additional data by themselves, they were able to demonstrate pretty conclusively that it wasn't the result of natural processes. It was the result of infrastructure decisions that led to that neighborhood constantly being flooded. They were even to trace those infrastructure decisions back to specific rebuilding efforts after disasters. And what they found is that the policy of prioritizing cost-benefit analysis in money for rebuilding exacerbated an underinvestment in these neighborhoods. That got the attention of a local county commissioner. He took that work all the way forward and made a case for awarding rebuilding money, not based solely on cost benefit, but based on vulnerability. And so that is a step towards using science to advance that kind of human right. It's about science as an ally for justice. If we go to the next slide, this is sort of my goal is to try to make community science a part of the scientific enterprise, to introduce these ideas of beginning with community priorities, ending with community impact, being an ally for justice, thinking about science as a partner, as operating with humility, to build that into the scientific enterprise. One of the ways we do that is by giving scientists the experience of working with communities. And helping those scientists feel supported and trained to do that work in a responsive, humble, partnership-oriented kind of way. We've done about 200 projects this way. All of the scientists contribute as volunteers. And that points to something that I'll talk about in the next slide, which were what are some of the institutional changes we can make to make this kind of work more common in the scientific community. And I really want to acknowledge some of the institutions that have been at the leading edge of community science for decades, institutions like Haskell Indian Nations University. And my dream is that we see these institutions as the leaders they are, and that when we start to invest in community science, which we are starting to do at a national and federal level, that those communities benefit from that investment. And it isn't the Stanfords and the Harvards who benefit from that. I think we have an opportunity in this to remedy some historic underinvestment in some amazing institutions. But the institutional changes we need to see are training for scientists. It's not enough to be a technical expert. You need training in cultural competency, listening, facilitation, active engagement. We need to offer incentives for community engaged work. Right now, the currency of academia is papers. What if the currency of academia was impact? We need to provide infrastructure. We don't ask people when they go into chemistry to build their lab and then do their research. We provide them with a lab. What if we created spaces where community engagement could happen? What if we, and lastly, and probably most importantly for me, is instead of funding scientists to go out and find community groups to work with, we should be funding community groups to go and find the scientists they want to work with. And with that, I'll stop and thank you very much.
Well, that was, our order was not planned, but I don't think it could have gone any better. Thank you, Raj, in terms of providing an incredible umbrella of all of the excellent presentations we have seen today. We would like to open the floor right now for questions. Yes, Courtney, if you could please spotlight questions from the public comment. While we're waiting for a question to come, oh, here we go. This is for every presenter. How do the research projects you're doing get initiated? Like, how do you partner with the community, and how are you reaching out? What's that exchange look like for this community science? I don't want to call on anybody, but I will. Okay, I'm gonna start with you, Grace, and then go to Raj, and then Jose.
Well, we have really taken our lead from our community groups. As I mentioned, we had worked with them to develop their EJ action plans, and then we gave them some funding and let them choose which of the items on their action plan to implement. And so I think it's just as Raj was saying, it has to be community identified priorities and what they want to get done. And so we don't speak for them or choose for them. We let them initiate what they would like to do, and then just try to provide the support in the work that they're doing.
Okay. Raj?
For us, it's been really helpful to work with partners, organizations that have lots of community connections and have earned the trust and confidence of communities. And we try to earn those organizations' trust and confidence and ask them for introductions into the community. And then when we get those introductions, is what Grace described. It's one of the things we try to do is show up, shut up, and bring food. Showing up means being in the space. Shutting up means listening, and bringing food means thinking about the gifts you have to offer, but thinking about those gifts in the larger context of all the gifts.
Jose?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of being in both worlds where I'm actively working for an organization, but also working on my PhD, right? So I think for me, I'm kind of seeing it from both sides, right? Where I know as an organization, there's been a lot of times where researchers or professors have approached us in what we felt like was an improper way, right? Though oftentimes they'll be like, hey, we put this grant together and we have 2 weeks to submit the application, and would you like to be a part of it? Or like we want to do this for you. So I think that kind of experience also informs me as a future researcher. I mean, as a researcher now, but also as a when I do get into the academic world of like how you approach community is so important, right? And actually talking to the community, seeing what their needs are, what their issues are, before you come and approach them with with whatever idea you might have for that community. I think it's really important, yeah, like Raj just said, right, to listen, to know what the community actually is dealing with, and then using university resources or academic resources or your research skills or whatever it is to then advance the work of what the community wants.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Johnston or Dr. Osborne, is there anything you'd like to add to what our other three panelists have said?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of roles as academics we can play. So oftentimes, before any kind of formal research project is started, like you get requests on communities wanting to understand impacts of lead or air pollution, working with them to provide some of this information to city council or other decision makers. And so starting there and through building those relationships, and then that is what can build the blocks that are necessary to move towards a research project if that's of interest. But oftentimes these were sometimes communities don't want to do a research project, and that's also totally fine. And so being able to maintain and facilitate helping with capacity building as appropriate, I think is a key aspect of it doesn't always need to lead to research.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think in my experience, it's probably a little bit different in that I'm in academia, but really started this work, as a community member. And so I would say that some of the projects that I've been engaged in, they just kind of really developed organically because there was a relationship there. In some cases, I do work, in my own community. So as we're sitting around at community meetings, trying to figure out, what the pathway is to some sort of solution, I think when I was a PhD student, I was able to share, some, scientific tools that we could, potentially use. And, people liked, some of those ideas. And now since we started, engaging in different types of projects, people kind of come up with lots of ideas now. Can't we do this? Can't we do that? Can't we collect this data? Can't we, create this database and show this or that? So it's happened really organically, but, that relationship, has been there as a building block.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So, oh, yes, please go ahead, Grace.
I wanted to build on what Dr. Osborne was saying, just because we have tried to make, as part of our data to action project, data available and actionable to the community groups. And I think sometimes when they see it or visualize it being on a map and they see the disparities, I think it is really sometimes more of an impetus also to see how like they want to address some of those issues. Um,
So, Aaron, I think the big takeaway here is really, I heard all of our panelists say the importance of really listening and the importance of partnerships. And also, to Dr. Osborne's point around sometimes things just happen organically. So, this is a great question around what suggestions can you recommend to help re-engage communities who've been ignored and have little faith in collaboration with organizations? I'd love to hear your answers on this one.
I'll just say that the proof is in the pudding, right? It's about the impact that Raj was talking about. And if folks see you or see engagement with some organizations as something that's just furthering those organizations' agenda, then it's not, in some cases it's just not going to work. And so for me, when I think about it, at its core, and I'm not saying saying that it's bad to approach communities with opportunities, but I really I try to let those opportunities come from the community. There's a problem that they are sharing, wanting to find some solutions, reaching out, asking for assistance and collaboration. And to me, when that happens, then we're on a good track, at least to kind of get started. But I do, recognize that there, and even, I've had some experiences where I was able to say, hey, there's this opportunity that came across my desk. Is this of interest? But it's not about, kind of pushing or trying to force communities to do something. And, the impact, like how they see these organizations show up, is going to make the difference, I think, in terms of, them, being engaged and feeling like there can be some equitable partnerships that would be beneficial to the community.
Anyone else on the panel? Okay. Raj, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. I was going to say sometimes we have asked folks, like, what would it take to earn your trust? What would it take to earn back the trust and we're maybe pretty honest about our role in losing that trust as an institution. And so being, how can we repair the harm we've done in the past is one of the questions we sometimes ask. And then if you get an answer, you got to do it. Like, you can't argue about the answer. So that's what I would offer for this question.
Okay, great. Jose, Jill, or Grace, is there anything else you'd like to add, or are we ready to move on to our next question?
I think Dr. Osborne and Raj covered it really well.
Okay, thank you. Courtney, could you please post the next question for our panelist? This question is for you, Jose. Are the industries in Chicago required to provide environmental impact statements pursuant to NEPA and other environmental laws?
Thank you for this question. So this is actually a loaded question with a loaded answer that I think we are running a little bit out of time. But the short answer is IEPA doesn't actually hold a lot of the industries in Chicago accountable. There's a lot of times where industries are operating without permits. So the short answer is yes and no. It's they're required to, but a lot of times they're not. It's not enforced by IEPA or by CDPH. So we could definitely follow up and talk more about that offline. But I don't want to take up too much more time answering that 'cause I know we're running out of time. But yeah, short answer is no.
So, the final question here to all of the panelists is, if you could have one quick piece of advice you would share with everybody who's listening today around, community science, what would your one piece of advice be? Is it impact? Is it partnerships? Is it listening? What is it? We'll start with Jill, Jose, Grace, Raj, and we'll finish with Dr. Osborne.
Sure. I would say dialogue would be the biggest piece of advice I would give, and just to have those pathways of communication on a regular basis with the community organizations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. And I also forgot to add in, just to answer the last question real quick too. If federal money is involved, then they actually are required as well. I forgot to add that in. But I think, yeah, the piece of advice I think is that people know they know their own experiences, and often people are actual community scientists themselves, right? And I think we have to also empower young people, empower community members to also engage in researching their own lives as well, and uplifting their experiences as ones that are part of being a community scientist.
I would say, from my perspective, it's listening and humility. Citizen science, I think, just teaches us that citizens are collecting the data that they already have been experiencing in their lived lives, their daily lives on a regular basis. And it's just our ability to use science to catch up to that. So I think humility is an important thing to stop and listen, and to really to take a person's experience and knowledge into account, and that is what's really important in community science.
Everything, like humility, respect, listening, all of that. And maybe, since everybody else said that, I'll add something someone told me once: when you don't know where to start, just start.
Yeah, I was also planning to say humility. So perhaps what I might add to it is, well, maybe I'll still use humility, but really encouraging, folks to see the value that everyone brings, value the expertise that all who can be engaged in community science, have and are bringing to the table, and be willing to be taught, by others, to learn from that lived experience, and to not, I guess, put one way of knowing or source of knowledge over another.
It was bound to happen. This has been, like, I don't know, 2 years in this, and I always put myself on mute. I was so proud because I'd made it all the way through. But it's inevitably going to happen for me. I just want to say a huge thanks to our panelists, not just for showing up today, but for showing up every day, and the work that you do with the humility and the ability to listen and the ability to understand that while a number of us on this call may have a PhD or graduate degree, we do not have the lived expertise of the folks in those communities, and they know where the problems are and how to solve them. Thank you so much. Wonderful session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.